Hey everybody.
Seven, 10, 19, 15, 16, 17, 13, 20. Player wins. Place your bets, please.
Well, that was fortunate. Let's take a look at blackjack. Greetings once again. Today we're going to talk about blackjack. And I'm going to discuss some of the history of the game, and in particular, some of the key developments and innovations in blackjack that led to the creation or the invention of the knockout system that I was fortunate enough to create with a colleague, Ken Fuchs. And you can find more information about the knockout system in our book called Knock-Out Blackjack. Begin by talking about the game of blackjack. The object of blackjack is not to get to 21. It's not to get to a closer total of 21 than the dealer has. The object is simply to win. And sometimes as a player, you'll want to get close to a total of 21 if you can. Other times, you won't care at all about getting close to a total of 21. And this particular video will be the first in a series about knockout blackjack. And as we go through this series, I will discuss the basic strategy and how it's derived and how to help memorize it and what it means. And I'll also discuss card counting, why it works in blackjack, for example, why it doesn't work in baccarat. And I'll introduce you to the knockout system and how you can learn how to card count with this very simple system. We'll do some exercises together that will get you acclimated to card counting. And I think by the end of the series, you'll be in a position to card count in casinos. So the player is playing against the dealer. You're not playing against other players. And this is a common fallacy in blackjack where you think that other players can affect you. Like, oh, that guy took away the dealer's bus card. Or if I'm doubling down, that guy took my 10 card. Well, it turns out mathematically, it doesn't matter if other players are playing or not on any particular round that you play. Whether they are there or not, whether they hit or not, whatever strategy they adopt or not, it can be proven mathematically that they make no difference to your outcome for a particular round. And in blackjack, the player goes first. He goes before the dealer does anything. And the player has options. He can hit, stand, double down, or split. The house goes last, and the house always plays by a fixed set of hitting and standing rules. And that's kind of blackjack in a nutshell. Let me proceed to explain where the house advantage comes about. Believe it or not, the only source of the house advantage is that if both the player and the dealer bust, the house wins. Because the player goes first, if the player busts, in other words, the player hits and draws to a total that exceeds 21. So for example, player has a 10-6 and he hits and he gets another 10. That's 26. That's a bust. The player immediately loses. So the only source of the house advantage is that if both the player and the dealer bust, the house wins that hand. To counter this, the player may play strategically as he or she sees fit. For example, hitting, standing, doubling down, splitting. Some casinos offer surrender, and insurance would be another option. While the house has to play by this fixed set of rules. And that fixed set of house rules is known to the player. And another asymmetry in the rules is this, that the player gets a bonus for a natural blackjack. So if I'm dealt an ace and a queen, that's a blackjack, or what's called a natural, I get paid 3-2. So if I have a $10 bet and I get an ace and a queen, and the dealer doesn't have a blackjack, I'll get paid $15. On the other hand, if the dealer gets the ace and the queen, and I don't get a blackjack, they just collect my $10. So there's an asymmetry in payoffs where the player gets a bonus, a 3-2 bonus for blackjacks. And let me pause right here and say a lot of casinos are offering 6-5 on blackjack. And 6-5, that ratio is 1.2. That is not as good as 3-2, where the ratio is 1.5. So if at all possible, and especially if you're going to consider card counting, look for 3-2 tables. Well, the first major step in correctly understanding conceptually what's happening in blackjack came about with the advent of what's called the basic strategy. Now, the exact origins of blackjack are not well known or documented. Some variations of the game may have existed in Europe hundreds of years ago. But the game as we know it today, as is dealt in the United States, known as blackjack, probably started just about 100 years ago in the early 20th century. And the basic strategy was not derived for about 30 or 40 years after that. And what is the basic strategy? If you're going to get good at blackjack, you need to know the basic strategy. Simply summarized, it's a way for the player to play optimally. So it's the best way for you to play based on your total that you hold in your hand and the dealer's up card. It takes maximum advantage of your strategy options: hitting, standing, doubling down, splitting, and so on. Now, this is interesting. It was originally derived through 12 man-years of painstaking calculations on electronic calculators by Baldwin, Canty, Maisel, and McDermott in 1956. And much of what I'm going to be presenting in this particular video is drawn from my book that I co-authored with Kent Fuchs called Knock-Out Blackjack. And in particular, the history of blackjack, much of which I'm talking about here, but much more detail of which is given in the book, is presented in chapter 1. What they determined was that the house advantage was something between 0% and 0.5%. And that was true then, and it is true today if you find a 3-2 game for naturals. And a 0 to 0.5% house advantage, as you might expect, happens to be very low compared to other casino games. So one of the reasons blackjack can be beaten is the house advantage to begin with is very low, of order 0.5%. And this was derived in the mid-50s and is now known as the basic strategy. The basic strategy is not about card counting. It's just about how to maximize or optimize your return, just taking into account your total and the dealer's up card. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this video on the basic strategy other than to show you what it looks like. There are some key things about the basic strategy that you should understand conceptually. And let's drop down right to the middle here. And this would be what we call the hard total. So a hard 17, 16, 15, 14. Also known as stiff totals because you may hit and bust immediately. So it's kind of risky. And one of the things you can see here is that if the dealer has an up card of 2 through 6, you're generally standing with a stiff total. And if the dealer has an up card of 7 or more, you're generally hitting with a stiff total. And that was one of the things that the Baldwin group discovered, is that you've got to hit aggressively if the dealer is showing strength with a 7 or more, even if you have a stiff total. On the other hand, if the dealer is showing weakness, so he's got a 2 through 6, which is a weak up card, then you're generally standing. Soft totals down here are basically, you can think about those as the ace is counted as an 11 in a soft total. And in blackjack, the ace can be an 8, an 11, or a 1. So if you have an ace and a 5, for example, that can be a 16 or a 6. It's up to you as a player what you want to count that as. But because the dealer is going to draw to a total of 17 through 21, what you have to recognize as a player is a 16 for you is the same as a 12, it's the same as an 8, and it's the same as a 5 if you stand. The only way you're going to win with a 16, if you stand, is if the dealer busts, because he will always hit until reaching that total of 17 through 21. So if you stand on a 16, your chance of winning is the same as if you had been dealt an 8 and stood. The only way you'll win is if the dealer busts. So with a soft 16, with that logic, it makes sense then that it, of course, makes sense that we're going to try to hit. It's a free hit. We can't bust on that because if we draw another 10, for example, it becomes a hard 16. The ace then becomes a value of 1. We still have a 16. So it's a free hit, if you will, with a 16. And that's why for soft totals, generally, you should be hitting until you reach a total of about 18. This will be discussed more in this series of videos on the knockout system when we get to the basic strategy. But for now, understand that it's a matrix where what you have in your hand is here on the left, and the dealer's up card is here, and then the strategy you should adopt is presented to you. The Baldwin Group had a number of important discoveries or findings compared to the prevailing wisdom or observations of that time. One was that 8 should be split, that you should split 8s. That's commonly known today, even among newbies in blackjack, but back then, splitting eights was seldom seen. They also discovered that 10 should not be split. Most players today know that 10 should not be split, but back then, splitting tens and face cards was not uncommon. They also determined that doubling down was the most neglected and underrated aspect of blackjack at that time. At the time, they noted that doubling down was not recommended by any of the leading writers about the game of blackjack. Today, of course, doubling down is well understood, and players enjoy doubling down because it's an opportunity to put out more money in a situation where you generally have the advantage as a player. And they discovered that the player's chance of winning is heavily dependent on the dealer's up card, which we understand well today. Well, let me go next to card counting. Now, card counting was discovered by Dr. Edward Thorpe in the 1960s. And this was, I agree with Alan Wilson, who is a famous blackjack author, this was, quote, a veritable supernova. Edward Thorpe really blew the top off of blackjack and really exploded the game almost single-handedly in terms of popularity when he wrote a book called Beat the Dealer that demonstrated that you could beat this game by card counting. Now, Thorpe was familiar with the Baldwin Group, their paper on the basic strategy, and he took exceptions to two assumptions that the Baldwin Group made. And these are what the Baldwin Group said. The Baldwin Group said, quote, the player doesn't have the time or inclination to utilize information available in the hands of the players preceding him. And the second quote that Thorpe took exception to by Baldwin was, there are tremendous difficulties in using this information, except in an intuitive, non-scientific manner. So what Thorpe did in terms of his breakthroughs and the way of his approach to the game is he realized first and foremost that all the cards are not created equal. The Baldwin Group had showed previously that for present cards in play, the cards that you're looking at that comprise your hand and the dealer's up card, for those cards in play, certain cards were favorable to me as a player and others to the dealer. But Ed Thorpe took this concept a giant leap forward. Dr. Thorpe reasoned that in general, among the remaining cards, those not even seen yet, those yet unplayed, still in the pack that the dealer has yet to deal out, an excess of certain cards were beneficial to the player. We call those good cards, while an excess of other cards were helpful to the dealer. And as card counters, we call those bad cards. Now, Dr. Thorpe coded in Fortran, and over the course of several years, he used computers. He had access to computers that the Baldwin Group did not. But nevertheless, it took several years, and he used computers to create the world's first card counting system. And Thorpe's computers performed the equivalent of about 10,000 man-years of work. And about 10,000 man-years of work in that era would have taken a computer about 10 minutes. So conceptually, what did Ed Thorpe discover? Well, sequential hands in blackjack are dependent events. So unlike craps, where each roll of the two dice is independent, or unlike roulette, where a spin of the ball on a fair wheel, each spin is independent. In blackjack, because you are not shuffling between sequential hands, you shuffle a pack and then you deal multiple hands from that same pack before you then shuffle again. So in between shuffles, sequential hands are dependent events. What happened on a previous hand, in principle, has influence or effects or gives me information about what will happen on subsequent hands before the next shuffle. That was a key breakthrough that Ed Thorpe discovered. Second, information on cards already played gives us the information about cards still to be played. So for example, think of a single deck. If in the first hand that comes out to, let's say, 3 players, 2 of the players get a blackjack and the other guy splits aces, I know that on the next round to these players, there won't be any more blackjacks because all 4 aces are gone. All 4 aces were dealt in the first round. There are no more aces to be played until the next shuffle. So that's the kind of the genesis or the basis of card counting is I use information about the cards I've seen, and that will give me information about the cards remaining to be played. And if I identify the relative abundance, or what we call the count, of the remaining good and bad cards, I can then estimate my advantage or disadvantage, and I can bet accordingly. If I have the advantage over the house, I'm going to bet more. If I have a disadvantage, so the house has the advantage, I'm going to bet less. Card counting is kind of that simple, and about 75% of your advantage comes from proper betting based on identifying whether I have the advantage or the house has the advantage. The remaining 25%, if you choose to do it, comes from modifying the basic strategy that we just looked at based on the count. In other words, if I know that there are a lot of high cards left in the deck, let's say a lot of 10s, then I might be more likely to double down on an 11 or a 10, or even maybe a 9, because I know I'm more likely to get a 10, and vice versa. And we'll discuss that more conceptually when we talk about card counting and adjustments to the basic strategy. So turning now to the knockout system that Ken Fuchs and I created and wrote the book Knock-Out Blackjack about. I first want to say that the knockout system that we put together was built on the shoulders of other innovators. It was built on the shoulders of the Baldwin group. It was built on the shoulders of Dr. Thorpe and his discoveries about card counting. But there are a number of other individuals that I'd like to touch on, and that we touch on in the book as well, that we owe credit to and are owed credit for their discoveries about blackjack. Blackjack is just a wonderful, rich game mathematically, with much to discover about it if you're new to the game, and much to appreciate about it if you understand that it's been around 100 years, and today it's more or less dealt the way it was 100 years ago. And yet, it's a game that has almost no house advantage, and through proper play and judicious play through card counting, you can actually beat the game. So I want to mention Claude Shannon proposed a simple set of count values known as the high-low in 1961. It was made popular by Harvey Dubner in 1963. And then Julian Braun created the correct betting and player strategies associated with that. And this card counting system appeared in the second edition of Dr. Thorpe's Beat the Dealer book in 1966. So the key breakthrough here was that instead of a complex system as initially presented in Dr. Thorpe's Beat the Dealer, a much simpler system was presented in the second edition. Peter Griffin, who was a mathematician at Cal State, profoundly improved our knowledge conceptually and theoretically of understanding of in terms of blackjack in his seminal book called The Theory of Blackjack, which was published in 1979. John Gwynne Jr., Dr. Gwynne, and Jeffrey Sy were the first ones to study the effects of slight errors in the count. For example, if you miscount slightly or you miss a card, or when you convert the count to what's called a true count in many balance systems. And they were the first to show that this actually had a minimal effect on the player's performance. So small errors actually don't hurt you much at all. Arnold Snyder in 1983 introduced what's known as the first unbalanced count. And in future videos in this series, I'll delve into what's the difference between a balanced and an unbalanced count. But suffice it to say here for this video, an unbalanced count, you don't need to estimate how many decks are remaining. And often you have to estimate to a fraction, let's say like 3 3/4 or 1 1/4. And then you don't have to do mental gymnastics of multiplication and division of fractions in your head. So unbalanced counts are simpler than balanced counts. And he introduced the first ever unbalanced count in 1983, which was known as Red 7. This is in his book called Black Belt in Blackjack. He also advocated for a greatly reduced strategy matrix. And if you looked at the basic strategy, what you saw there is that matrix has actually over 200 separate strategies that you need to memorize in the basic strategy, much of which, if you understand the game conceptually, becomes second nature. It's not difficult to memorize that particular basic strategy if you take some time and understand the game. And Don Schlesinger in 1986 exhaustively evaluated all of the strategy matrix elements, if you were a card counter, and discovered that instead of this over 200 values that you might need to memorize individual counts for, individual numbers for, he discovered that the so-called illustrious 18 of those give you about 80% of the possible gain you can get from strategic variations in card counting. And he discussed this in an article called Attacking the Shoe, which appeared in Blackjack Forum in 1986. So these gentlemen, these scientists, these mathematicians, these discoverers, if you will, of blackjack, played a huge part and are the giants that Ken Fuchs and I stood on in terms of what we put together in terms of the knockout system. I would like to mention that I've had the privilege of meeting Dr. Thorpe more than once, and he is a joy. He's a joyful person. I found him to be brilliant, exceptionally smart. He loves puzzles. He loves problem solving. And I dare say he is the smartest person that I have ever met. I also had the good fortune of actually playing blackjack with Professor Peter Griffin in Las Vegas, and he was known as an exceptional blackjack player who used very complex card counting systems and was able to do so even while having a Heineken or two, which I joined him in. And so he and I had some fun escapades here in Las Vegas. And I also wanted to mention that I had the great pleasure of meeting and knowing Professor John Gwynn. And he and I discussed blackjack. He and I also worked on a project together having to do with pike out tiles. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. There will be future videos in this series on card counting and in particular on the knockout system. I hope you'll join me for those. Take care.